The cat seemed almost unbelievably heavy, as if death had settled onto it like a physical weight. Christ, it feels like a bucket of sand. Judd held the other side of the bag, and Lewis dropped Church in, glad to be rid of that strange, unpleasant weight. What are you going to do with it now? Judd asked. Put him in the garage, I guess, Lewis said. Bury him in the morning. In the pet cemetery? Lewis shrugged. Suppose so. Going to tell Ellie? I'll have to mull that one over a while. Judd was quiet a moment longer, and then he seemed to reach a decision. Wait here a minute or two, Lewis. Judd moved away, with no apparent thought that Lewis might not want to wait just a minute on this bitter night. He moved away with assurance, and that little ease which was so strange in a man of his age. And Lewis found he had nothing to say anyway. He didn't feel much like himself. He watched Judd go, quite content to stand here. He raised his face into the wind after the door had clicked closed, the garbage bag with Church's body in it riffling between his feet. Content. Yes, he was. For the first time since he had moved to Maine, he felt that he was in his place, that he was home, standing here by himself in the afterglow of the day, standing on the rim of winter. He felt unhappy and yet oddly exhilarated and strangely whole. Whole in a way he had not been, or could not remember feeling that he had been, since childhood. Something's gonna happen here, Bubba. Something pretty weird, I think. He tilted his head back and saw cold winter stars in a blackening sky. How long he stood like that he did not know, although it could not have been long in terms of seconds and minutes. Then a light flickered on Judd's porch, bobbed, approached the porch door, and descended the steps. It was Judd behind a big 4-cell flashlight. In his other hand he held what Lewis at first thought was a large X, and then he saw that it was a pick and a shovel. He handed the shovel to Lewis, who took it in his free hand. Judd, what the hell are you up to? We can't bury him tonight. Yeah, we can. And we're gonna. Judd's face was lost behind the glaring circle of the flashlight. Judd, it's dark. It's late. And cold. Come on, Judd said. Let's get it done. Lewis shook his head and tried to begin again, but the words came hard, the words of explanation and reason. They seemed so meaningless against the low shriek of the wind, the seedling bed of stars in the black. It can wait till tomorrow, when we can see. Does she love the cat? Yes, but... Judd's voice, soft and somehow logical. And do you love her? Of course I love her. She's my dog.
Then come on.
Louis went. Twice, maybe 3 times, on the walk up to the pet cemetery that night, Louis tried to talk to Judd, but Judd didn't answer. Louis gave up. That feeling of contentment, odd under the circumstances but a pure fact, persisted. It seemed to come from everywhere. The steady ache in his muscles from carrying church in one hand and the shovel in the other was a part of it. The wind, deadly cold, numbing exposed skin, was a part of it. It wound steadily in the trees. Once they got into the woods, there was no snow to speak of. The bobbing light of Judd's flash was a part of it. He felt the pervasive, undeniable, magnetic presence of some secret, some dark secret. The shadows fell away, and there was a feeling of space. Snow shone pallidly.
Rest here,
Judd said, and Louis set the bag down. He wiped sweat off his forehead from his arm. Rest here? But they were here. He could see the markers in the moving, aimless sweep of Judd's light as Judd sat down in the thin snow and put his face between his arms.
Judd, are you all right? Fine. Need to catch my breath a bit, that's all.
Louis sat down next to him and deep-breathed 6 times. You know, he said, I feel better than I have in maybe 6 years. I know that's crazy, and a crazy thing to say when you're burying your daughter's cat, but it's the flat truth, Judd. I feel good. Judd breathed deeply once or twice himself.
Yeah, I know,
he said.
It is that way once in a while. You don't pick up your times for feeling good any more than you do for the other. And the place has something to do with it too, but you don't want to trust that. Heroin makes dope addicts feel good when they're putting it in their arms, but all the time it's poisoning them, poisoning their bodies and poisoning their way of thinking. This place can be like that, Louis, and don't you ever forget it. I hope to God I'm doing right. I think I am, but I can't be sure. Sometimes my head gets muddled. It's senility coming, I think.
I don't know what you're talking about.
This place has power, Louis. Not so much here, but the place we're going.
Judd.
Come on,
Judd said, and was on his feet again. The flashlight's beam illuminated the deadfall. Judd was walking toward it. Louis suddenly remembered his episode of somnambulism. What was it Pascal had said in the dream that had accompanied it? Don't go beyond, no matter how much you feel you need to, Doctor. The barrier was made not to be broken. But now, tonight, that dream or warning or whatever it had been seemed years rather than months distant. Louis felt fine and fey and alive, ready to cope with anything, and yet full of wonder. It occurred to him that this was very much like a dream. Then Judd turned toward him, the hood seeming to surrender a blankness, and for one moment Louis imagined that it was Pascal himself who now stood before him, that the shining light would be reversed, trained on a grinning, gibberish skull, framed in fur, and his fear returned like a dash of cold water.
"Judd," he said, "we can't climb over that. We'll each break a leg and then probably freeze to death trying to get back." "Just follow me," Judd said. "Follow me and don't look down. Don't hesitate and don't look down. I know the way though, but it has to be done quick and sure."
Louis began to think that perhaps it was a dream, that he had simply never awakened from his afternoon nap.
If I was asleep, he thought, I'd no more head up that deadfall than I'd get drunk and go skydiving. But I'm going to do it. I really think I am. So, I must be dreaming, right?
Judd angled himself slightly left, away from the center of the deadfall. The flash's beam centered brightly on the jumbled heap of bones, fallen trees, and odd logs. The circle of the light grew smaller and even brighter as they approached. Without the slightest pause, without even a brief scan to assure himself that he was in the right place, Judd started up. He did not scramble. He did not climb bent over, the way a man will climb a rocky hillside or a sandy slope. He simply mounted, as if climbing a set of stairs. He walked like a man who knows exactly where his next step is coming from. Louis followed the same way. He did not look down or search for footholds. It came to him with a strange but total surety that the deadfall could not harm him unless he allowed it to. It was a piece of utter assholery, of course, like the stupid confidence of a man who believes it's safe to drive when totally shit-faced as long as he's wearing his St. Christopher's medallion. But it worked. There was no pistol-shot snap of an old branch giving way, no sickening plunge into a hole lined with jutting, weather-whitened splinters, each one ready to cut and gore and mangle. His shoes, hush-puppy loafers, hardly recommended for climbing deadfalls, did not slip on the old dry moss which had overgrown many of the fallen trees. He pitched neither forward nor backward. The wind sang wildly through the fir trees all around them. For a moment he saw Judd standing on top of the deadfall, and then he began down the far side, calves dropping out of sight, then thighs, then hips and waist. The light bounced randomly off the whipping branches of the trees on the other side of the barrier. Yes, that's what it was. Why try to pretend it wasn't? The barrier. Louis reached the top himself and paused there momentarily, right foot planted on an old fallen tree that was canted up at a 35-degree angle, left foot on something springier. A mesh of old fir branches? He didn't look down to see, but only switched the heavy trash bag with Church's body in it from his right hand to his left, exchanging it for the lighter shovel. He turned his face up into the wind and felt it sweep past him in an endless current, lifting his hair. It was so cold, so clean, so consistent. Moving casually, almost sauntering, he started down again. Once a branch that felt to the thickness of a brawny man's wrist snapped loudly under his foot, but he felt no concern at all, and his plunging foot was stopped firmly by a heavier branch, some 4 inches down. Lewis hardly staggered. He supposed that now he could understand how company commanders in World War I had been able to stroll along the top of the trenches with bullets snapping all around them, whistling Tipperary. It was crazy, but the very craziness made it tremendously exhilarating. He walked down, looking straight ahead at the bright circle of Judd's light. Judd was standing there, waiting for him. Then he reached the bottom, and the exhilaration flared up in him like a shot of coal oil on embers.
"We made it,"
he shouted. He put the shovel down and clapped Judd on the shoulder. He remembered climbing an apple tree to the top fork where it swayed in the wind like a ship's mast. He had not felt so young or so viscerally alive in 20 years or more. "Judd, we made it."
"Did you think we wouldn't?"
Judd asked. Lewis opened his mouth to say something. "Think we wouldn't? We're damn lucky we didn't kill ourselves." And then he shut it again. He had never really questioned at all, not from the moment Judd approached the deadfall. And he was not worried about getting back over again. "I guess not," he said.
"Come on, we got a piece to walk yet. 3 miles more."
They walked. The path did indeed go on. In places it seemed very wide, although the moving light revealed little clearly. It was mostly a feeling of space, a feeling that the trees had drawn back. Once or twice, Lewis looked up and saw stars wheeling between the massed dark border of trees. Once something lopped across the path ahead of them, and the light picked up the reflection of greenish eyes, there and then gone. At other times, the path closed in until underbrush scratched stiff fingers across the shoulders of Lewis's coat. He switched the bag and the shovel more often, but the ache in his shoulders was now constant. He fell into a rhythm of walking and becoming almost hypnotized with it. There was power here, yes. He felt it. He remembered a time when he had been a senior in high school. He and his girl and some other couple had gone way out in the boonies and had ended up nicking at the end of a dead-end road, near a power station. They hadn't been there long before Lewis's girl said that she wanted to go home, or at least to another place, because all her teeth, all the ones with fillings anyway, and that was most of them, were aching. Lewis had been glad to leave himself. The air around the power station had made him feel nervous and too awake. This was like that, but it was stronger. Stronger, but not unpleasant at all. It was... Judd had stopped. At the base of a long slope, Lewis ran into him. Judd turned toward him.
"We're almost where we're going now,"
he said calmly.
"This bit is like the deadfall. You got to walk steady and easy. Just follow me and don't look down. You felt us going downhill?"
"Yes."
"This is the edge of what the Micmacs used to call Little God Swamp. The fur traders who came through called it Dead Man's Bog, and most of them who came once and got out never came again."
"Is there quicksand?"
"Oh yeah, quicksand aplenty. Streams that bubble up through a big deposit of quartz sand left over from the glacier. Silica sand, we always called it, although there's probably a proper name for it."
Judd looked at him, and for a moment Lewis thought he saw something bright and not completely pleasant in the old man's eyes. Then Judd shifted the flashlight, and the look was gone.
"There's a lot of funny things down this way, Lewis. The air's heavier, more electrical, or something."
Lewis started.
"What's wrong?"
"Nothing," Lewis said, thinking of that night on the dead-end road.
"You might see St. Elmo's fire, what the sailors call food lights. It makes funny shapes, but it's nothing. If you should see some of those shapes, and they bother you, just look the other way. You may hear noises, like voices, but they are the loons down south toward Prospect. The sound carries. It's funny."
"Loons?" Lewis said doubtfully. "This time of year?"
"Oh yeah,"
Judd said again, and his voice was terribly bland and totally unreadable. For a moment, Lewis wished desperately he could see the old man's face again. That look. "Judd, where are we going? What the hell are we doing out here in the beyond?"
"I'll tell you when we get there."
Judd stepped away.
"Mind the tussocks."
They began to walk again, stepping from one broad hummock to the next. Lewis did not feel for them. His feet seemed to find them automatically, with no effort from him. He slipped only once, his left shoe breaking through a thin scum of ice and dipping into cold and somehow slimy standing water. He pulled it out quickly and went on, following Judd's bobbing light. That light, floating through the woods, brought back memories of the pirate tales he had liked to read as a boy. evil men off to bury gold doubloons by the dark of the moon. And of course, one of them would be tumbled into a pit on top of the chest, a bullet in his heart, because the pirates had believed, or so the authors of these lucrative tales solemnly attested, that the dead comrade's ghost would remain there to guard the sag. Except it's not treasure we've come to bury, just my daughter's castrated cat. He felt wild laughter bubble up inside and stifled it. He did not hear any sounds like voices, nor did he see any St. Elmo's fire. But after stepping over half a dozen tussocks, he looked down and saw that his feet, calves, knees, and lower thighs had disappeared into a ground fog that was perfectly smooth, perfectly white, and perfectly opaque. It was like moving through the world's lightest drift of snow. The air seemed to have a quality of light in it now, and it was warmer. He could have sworn it. He could see Judd before him, moving steadily along, the blunt end of the pick hooked over his shoulder. The pick in hands, the illusion of a man intent on burying treasure. That crazy sense of exhilaration persisted, and he suddenly wondered if maybe Rachel was trying to call him. If, back in the house, the phone was ringing and ringing, making its rational, prosaic sound. If he almost walked into Judd's back again. The old man had stopped in the middle of the path. His head was cocked to one side. His mouth was pursed and tense. Judd, what? Shh! Lewis hushed, looking around uneasily. Here the ground mist was thinner, but he still couldn't see his own shoes. Then he heard crackling underbrush and breaking branches. Something was moving out there, something big. He opened his mouth to ask if it was a moose. Bear was the thought that actually crossed his mind, and then he closed it again. The sound carriers, Judd had said. He cocked his head to one side in unconscious imitation of Judd, unaware that he was doing it, and listened. The sound seemed at first distant, then very close, moving away and then moving ominously toward them. Lewis felt the sweat on his forehead begin to trickle down his chapped cheeks. He shifted the hefty bag with Church's body in it from one hand to the other. His palm had damped, and the green plastic seemed greasy, wanting to slide from his fist. Now the thing out there seemed to be so close that Lewis expected to see its shape at any moment, rising up on two legs, perhaps, blotting out the stars with some unthought of immense and shaggy body. Bear was no longer what he was thinking of. Now he didn't know just what he was thinking of. Then it moved away and disappeared. Lewis opened his mouth again, the words, "What was that?" already on his tongue. Then a shrill, maniacal laughter came out of the darkness, rising and falling in hysterical circles, loud, piercing, chilling. To Louis, it seemed that every joint in his body had frozen solid, and that he had somehow gained weight, so much weight that he turned to run, he would plunge down and out of sight in the swampy ground. The laughter rose, split into dry cackles, like some rottenly friable chunk of rock, along many fault lines. It reached the pit of a scream, then sank into a guttural chuckling that might have become sobs before it faded out altogether. Somewhere there was a drip of water, and above them, like a steady river in a bed of sky, the monotonous whine of the wind. Otherwise, Little God's Swamp was silent. Louis began to shudder all over. His flesh, particularly that of his lower belly, began to cramp. Yes, cramp was the right word. His flesh actually seemed to be moving on his body. His mouth was totally dry. There seemed to be no spit at all left in it. Yet that feeling of exhilaration persisted, an unshakable lunacy. What in Christ's name? He whispered hoarsely to Judd. Judd turned to look at him, and in the dim light, Louis thought the old man looked 120. There was no sign of that odd, dancing light in his eyes now. His face was drawn, and there was stark terror in his eyes. But when he spoke, his voice was steady enough.
Just a loon, he said. Come on, we're almost there.
They went on. The tussocks became firm ground again. For a few moments, Louis had a sensation of open space. Although that dim glow in the air had now faded, it all was that he could do to make out Judd's back 3 feet in front of him. Short grass, stiff with frost, was underfoot. It broke like glass at every step. Then they were in the trees again. He could smell aromatic fur, feel needles. Occasionally, a twig or a branch scraped against him. Louis had lost all sense of time or direction, but they did not walk long before Judd stopped again and turned toward him.
Steps here,
he said.
Cut into rock. 42 or 44, I disremember which. Just follow me. We get to the top, and we're there.
He began to climb again, and again Louis followed. The stone steps were wide enough, but the sense of the ground dropping away was unsettling. Here and there his shoe gritted on a strew of pebbles and stone fragments. 12, 13, 14. The mind? Well, right now the mind is not sharp. The wind was sharper, colder, quickly numbing his face.
Are we above the tree line?
He wondered. He looked up and saw a billion stars, cold lights in the darkness. Never in his life had the stars made him feel so completely small. Infinite small. Without meaning. He asked himself the odd question, is there anything intelligent out there? And instead of wonder, the thought brought a horrid, cold feeling, as if he had asked himself what it might be like to eat a handful of squirming bugs. 26, 27, 28. Who cares about these anyway? Indians? The Micmacs? Were they tool-bearing Indians? I'll have to ask Judd. Tool-bearing Indians made him think of fur-bearing animals, and that made him think of that thing that had been moving near them in the woods. One foot stumbled, and he racked a gloved hand along the rock wall to his left for balance. The wall felt old, chipped and channeled and wrinkled, like dry skin that's almost worn out, he thought.
Are you all right, Louis?
Judd murmured. I'm okay, he said, although he was nearly out of breath and his muscles throbbed from the weight of church in the bag. 42, 44.
45,
Judd said.
I've forgotten. Haven't been up here in 12 years, I guess. Don't suppose I'll ever have a reason to come again. Here, up you come, and up you get.
He grabbed Louis's arm and helped him up the last step.
We're here,
Judd said. Louis looked around. He could see well enough. The starlight was dim but adequate. They were standing on a rocky, rubble-strewn plate of rock which slid out of the thin earth directly ahead like a dark tongue. Looking the other way, he could see the tops of the fir trees they had come through in order to reach the steps. They had apparently climbed to the top of some weird, flat-topped mesa, a geological anomaly that would have seemed far more normal in Arizona or New Mexico. Because the grassed over top of the mesa, or hill, or truncated mountain, or whatever it was bare of trees, the sun had melted the snow here. Turning back to Judd, Louis saw dry grasses bending before the steady wind that blew coldly in his face, and saw that it was a hill, not an isolated mesa. Ahead of them, the ground rose again toward trees. But this flatness was so obvious and so odd in the context of New England's low and somehow tired hills. Tool-bearing Indians, his mind suddenly spoke up.
Come on,
Judd said, and led him 25 yards toward the trees. The wind blew hard up here, but it felt clean. Louis saw a number of shapes just under the gloom cast by the trees. Trees which were the oddest, tallest firs he had ever seen. The whole effect of this high, lonely place was emptiness, but an emptiness which vibrated. The dark shapes were cairns of stones.
Micmacs sent it off the top of the hill here,
Judd said.
No one knows how. No more than anyone knows how the Mayans built their pyramids. And the Micmacs have forgotten themselves, just like the Mayans have.
Why? Why would they do that?
This was their burying ground,
Judd said.
I brought you here so you could bury Ellie's cat here. The Micmacs didn't desecrate, you know. They buried their pets right alongside their owners.
This made Lewis think of the Egyptians, who had gone that one better. They had slaughtered the pets of royalty so that the souls of the pets might go along to whatever afterlife there might be with the souls of their masters. He remembered reading about the slaughter of more than 10,000 domestic animals following the decease of one pharaoh's daughter. Included in the tally had been 600 pigs and 2,000 peacocks. The pigs had been scented with attar of roses, the dead lady's favorite perfume, before their throats were cut. And they built the pyramids too. No one knows for sure what the Mayan pyramids are for. Navigation and chromography, some say, like Stonehenge. But we know damn well what the Egyptian pyramids were and are. Great monuments to death. The world's biggest gravestones. Here lies Ramesses II. He was obedient. Lewis thought and uttered a wild, helpless cackle. Judd looked at him, unsurprised.
Go bury your cat,
he said.
I'm gonna have a smoke. I'd help you, but you gotta do it yourself. Each buries his own. That's the way it was done then.
Judd, what's this all about? Why did you bring me here?
Because you saved Norma's life,
Judd said, and although he sounded sincere, and Lewis was positive he believed himself sincere, he had a sudden, overpowering sense that the man was lying, or that he was being lied to and then passing the lie on to Lewis. He remembered that look he had seen, or thought he had seen, in Judd's eye. But up here, none of that seemed to matter. The wind mattered more, pushing freely around him in that steady river, lifting his hair from his brow and off his ears. Judd sat down with his back against one of the trees, cupped his hands around a match, and lit a Chesterfield.
You want to rest a bit before you start?
No, I'm okay, Lewis said. He could have pursued the questions, but he found he didn't really care to. This felt wrong, but it also felt right, and he decided to let that be enough, for now. There was really one thing he needed to know. Will I really be able to dig him a grave? The soil looks thin. Lewis nodded toward the place where the rock pushed out of the ground at the edge of the steps. Judd nodded slowly.
Uh-huh,
he said.
Soil's thin, all right, but soil deep enough to grow grass is generally deep enough to bury in, Lewis. and people have been burying here for a long, long time. You won't find it any too easy, though.
Nor did he. The ground was stony and hard, and very quickly he saw that he was going to need the pick to dig the grave deep enough to hold church. So he began to alternate, first using the pick to loosen the hard earth and stones, then the shovel to dig out what he had loosened. His hands began to hurt. His body began to warm up again. He felt a strong, unquestionable need to do a good job. He began to hum under his breath, something he sometimes did when 𝘒𝘪𝘴𝘗𝑠 a wound. Sometimes the pick would strike a hard rock enough to flash sparks, and the shiver would travel up the wooden haft to vibrate to his hands. He could feel blisters forming on his palms, and he didn't care, although he was, like most doctors, usually careful of his hands. Above and around him, the wind sang and sang, playing a 3-note melody. Counterpointing this, he heard the soft drop and chunk of rock. He looked over his shoulder and saw Judd hunkered down and pulling out the bigger rocks he had dug up, making a heap of them.
For your cairn,
he said when he saw Lewis looking.
Oh,
Lewis said, and went back to work. He made the grave about 2 feet wide and 3 feet long. A Cadillac of a grave for a damn cat, he thought. And when it was perhaps 30 inches deep and the pick was flashing sparks up from almost every stroke, he tossed it and the shovel aside and asked Judd if it was okay. Judd got up and took a curious look.
Seems fine to me,
he said.
Anyway, it's what you think that counts.
Will you tell me now what this is about? Judd smiled a little.
The Micmacs believed this hill was a magic place,
he said.
Believed this whole forest, from the swamp on north and east, was magic. They made this place, and they buried their dead here, away from everything else. Other tribes steered clear of it. The Penobscos said these woods were full of ghosts. Later on, the fur trappers started saying pretty much the same thing. I suppose some of them saw the foo fire in the little god swamp and thought they were seeing ghosts.
Judd smiled, and Lewis thought, this isn't what you think at all.
Later on, not even the Micmacs themselves would come here. One of them claimed he saw a wendigo here and that the ground had gone sour. They had a big pow-pow about it. Or so I heard the tale in my green years, Lewis. But I heard it from the old tosspot, Stanny B, which is what we all called Stanley Bouchard. And what Stanny B didn't know, he made up.
Lewis, who knew only that the Wendigo was supposed to be a spirit of the North Country, said, "Do you think the ground's gone sour?" Judd smiled, or at least his lips slated.
I think it's a dangerous place,
he said softly.
but not for cats or dogs or pet hamsters. Go on, bury your animal, Louis.
Louis lowered the hefty back into the hole and slowly shoveled the dirt back in. He was cold now and tired. The platter of the earth on the plastic was a depressing sound, and while he did not regret coming up here, that sense of exhilaration was fading, and he had begun to wish the adventure over. It was a long walk back home. The pattering sound muffled, then stopped. There was only the whomp of dirt on more dirt. He scrapped the last bit into the hole with the blade of the shovel. There's never enough, he thought, recalling something his undertaker uncle had said to him at least 1,000 years ago. Never enough to fill up the hole again. And then turned to Judd.
Your Carn,
Judd said.
Look, Judd, I'm pretty tired, and it's Ellie's cat,
Judd said, and his voice, although soft, was implacable.
She'd want you to do it right.
Louis said, I suppose she would. It took another 10 minutes to pile up the rocks Judd handed him, one by one. When it was done, there was a low, conical pile of stones on Church's grave, and Louis did indeed feel a small, tired pleasure. It looked right, somehow, rising with the others in the sunlight. He supposed Ellie would never see it. The thought of taking her through the patch of swamp here there was a quicksand would make Rachel's hair turn white. But he had seen it, and it was good.
Most of these have fallen over.
He stands there and brushing the knees of his pants. He was seeing more clearly now, and in several places he could clearly make out scattered strews of loose stones. But Judd had seen to it that he built his own cairn only from stones taken from the grave he himself had dug.
Uh-huh,
Judd said.
Told you. The place is old. Are we done now? Uh-huh.
He clapped Louis on the shoulder.
You did good, Louis. I knew you would. Let's go home.
Judd. He began again, but Judd only grabbed the pick and walked off toward the steps. Louis got the shovel, had to trot to catch up, and then saved his breath for walking. He looked back once, but the cairn marking the grave of his daughter's cat, Winston Churchill, had melted into the shadows, and he could not pick it out. We just ran the film backward, Louis thought tiredly, as they emerged from the woods and into the field overlooking his own house some time later. He did not know how much later. He had taken off his watch when he had lain down to doze that afternoon, and it would be there on the windowsill by his bed. He only knew that he was beat, used up, done in. He could not remember feeling so kicked dog weary since his first day on Chicago's rubbish disposal crew, one high school summer 16 or 17 years ago. They came back the same way they had gone, but he could remember very little about the trip. He stumbled on the deadfall. He remembered that. Lurching forward and thinking absurdly of Peter Pan. Oh, Jesus, I lost my happy thoughts, and down I come. And then Judd's hand had been there, firm and hard, and a few moments later they had been trotting past the final resting places of Smucky the cat and Trixie and Marta, our pet rabbit, and onto the path he had once walked, not only with Judd, but with his whole family. It seemed that in some weary way he had pondered the dream of Victor Pascal, the one which had resulted in his somnambulistic episode, but any connection between that night walk and this had eluded him. It had also occurred to him that the whole adventure had been dangerous, not in any melodramatic Wilkie Collins sense, but in a very real one, that he had outrageously blistered his hands while in a state that was nearly somnambulistic was really the least of it. He could have killed himself on the deadfall. Both of them could have. It was hard to square such behavior with sobriety. In his current exhaustion, he was willing to ascribe it to confusion and emotional upset over the death of a pet the whole family had loved. And after a time, there they were, home again. They walked toward it together, not speaking, and stopped again in Lewis's driveway. The wind moaned and whined. Wordlessly, Lewis handed Judd his pick.
I'd best get across,
Judd said at last.
Lola Bisson or Ruthie Parks will be bringing Norma home, and she'll wonder where the hell I am.
Do you have the time? Lewis asked. He was surprised that Norma wasn't home yet. In his muscles, it seemed to him that midnight must have struck.
Uh-huh,
Judd said.
I keep the time as long as I'm dressed, and then I let her go.
He fished a watch out of his pants pocket and flicked the scrolled cover back from its face.
It's gone 8:30,
he said, and snapped the cover closed again. 8:30? Lewis repeated stupidly. That's all?
How late did you think it was?
Judd asked. Later than that, Lewis said.
I'll see you tomorrow, Lewis,
Judd said, and began to walk away. Judd. He turned toward Lewis, mildly questioning. Judd, what did we do tonight?
Why, we buried your daughter's cat.
Is that all we did?
Nothing but that,
Judd said.
You're a good man, Lewis, but you ask too many questions. Sometimes people have to do things that just seem right. That seem right in their hearts, I mean. And if they do those things and then end up not feeling right, full of questions and sort of like they got indigestion, only inside their heads instead of in their guts, they think they made a mistake. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, Lewis said, thinking that Judd must have been reading his mind as the two of them walked downhill, through the field and toward the house lights.
What they don't think is that maybe they should be questioning those feelings of doubt before they question their own hearts,
Judd said, looking at him closely.
What do you think, Louis?
I think, Louis said slowly, that you might be right.
And the things that are in a man's heart, it don't do him much good to talk about these things, does it?
Well,
no,
Judd said, as if Louis had simply agreed.
It don't.
And in his calm voice, that was so sure and so implacable, in that voice which somehow put the chill through Louis, he said,
There are secret things. Women are supposed to be the ones good at keeping secrets, and I guess they do keep a few, but any woman who knows anything at all would tell you she's never really seen into a man's heart. The soil of a man's heart is stonier, Louis, like the soul up there in the Micmac burying ground. Bedrock's close. A man grows what he can and tends to it.
Judd,
don't question it, Louis. Accept what's done and follow your heart. But nothing. Accept what's done, Louis, and follow your heart. We did what was right this time. At least I hope to Christ it was right. Another time it could be wrong. Wrong as hell.
Will you at least answer one question?
Well, let's hear what it is. Then we'll see.
How did you know about that place? This question had also occurred to Louis on the way back, along with the suspicion that Judd himself might be part Micmac, although he did not look like it. He looked as if every one of his ancestors had been 100% card-calling Anglos.
Why, from Stanny B,
he said, looking surprised. He just told you?
No,
Judd said.
It's the kind of place you just tell everyone about. Not at all. I buried my dog Spot up there when I was 10. I was chasing a rabbit, and he ran out on some dusty barbed wire. The wound's infected, and it killed him.
There was something wrong about that, something that didn't fit with something Louis had been previously told, but he was too tired to puzzle out the discontinuity. Judd said no more, only looked at him from his inscrutable old man's eyes. Good night, Judd, Louis said.
Good night.
The old man crossed the road, carrying his pick and shovel. Thanks, Louis called impulsively. Judd didn't turn. He only raised one hand to indicate he had heard. And in the house, suddenly, the telephone began to ring. Louis ran, wincing at the aches that flared in his upper thighs and lower back. But by the time he had gotten into the warm kitchen, the phone had already rung 6 or 7 times. It stopped ringing just as he put his hand on it. He picked it up anyway and said hello, but there was only the open hum.
That was Rachel,
he thought.
I'll call her back.
But suddenly it seemed like too much work to dial the number, to dance clumsily with her mother, or worse, her checkbook brandishing father, to be passed on to Rachel, and then to Ellie. Ellie would still be up, of course. It was an hour earlier in Chicago. Ellie would ask how church was doing.
Great, he's fine. Got hit by an Oracle truck. Somehow I'm absolutely positive it was an Oracle truck. Anything else would lack dramatic unity, if you know what I mean. You don't? Well, never mind. The truck killed him, but didn't mark him up hardly at all. Judd and I planted him up in the old Micmac burying ground, sort of an annex to the pet cemetery, if you know what I mean. Amazing walk, Pumpkin. I'll tell you up there sometime, and we'll put flowers by his marker. Excuse me, his cairn, after the quicksand's frozen over, that is, and the bears go to sleep for the winter.
He rehung the telephone, crossed the sink, and filled it with hot water. He removed his shirt and washed. He had been sweating like a pig in spite of the cold, and a pig was exactly what he smelt like. There was some leftover meatloaf in the refrigerator. Louis cut it into slabs, put them on a slice of Roman meal bread, and added 2 thick rounds of Bermuda onion. He contemplated this for a moment before dousing it with ketchup and slapping down the other slice of bread. If Rachel and Ellie had been around, they would be wrinkling their noses in identical gestures of distaste. Yuck, gross.
Well, you missed it, ladies,
Louis thought with undeniable satisfaction, and gobbled his sandwich. It tasted great.
Confucius say, he who smell like pig eat like wolf,
he thought, and smiled. He chased the sandwich with several long swallows of milk directly from the carton, another habit Rachel frowned on strenuously. And then he went upstairs, undressed, and got into bed without even washing his teeth. His aches and pains had faded to one low throb that was almost comforting. His watch was there where he had left it, and he looked at it. 10 minutes of 9. It was really incredible. Louis turned off the light, turned over on his side, and slept. He woke sometime after 3 the next morning and shuffled to the bathroom. He was standing there urinating, blinking owlishly in the bright white fluorescent bathroom light, when the discrepancy suddenly showed up in his mind, and his eyes widened, as if 2 pieces of something which should have fitted together perfectly had instead thudded against one another and rebounded. Tonight, Judd had told him that his dog had died when he was 10, had died of an infection after scrapped up in a snarl of rusty barbed wire. But on the late summer day when all of them had walked up to the pet cemetery together, Judd said that his dog had died of old age and was buried there. He had even pointed out the marker, although the years had worn the inscription away. Louis flushed the toilet, turned out the light, and went back to bed. Something else was wrong as well, and in a moment he had it. Judd had been born with the century, and that day at the pet cemetery he had told Louis his dog had died during the first year of the Great War. That would have been when Judd was 14, if he had meant when the war actually started in Europe. When he was 17, if he had meant when America entered the war. But tonight, he had said that Spot died when he, Judd, was 10. Well, he's an old man, and old men get confused in their memories, he thought uneasily. He said himself that he's noticed signs of increasing forgetfulness, groping for names and addresses that used to come to him easily, sometimes getting up in the morning and having no memory of the chores he planned to do just the night before. For a man of his age, he's getting off pretty goddamned light. Senility is probably too strong a word for it in Judd's case. Forgetfulness is actually better, more accurate. Nothing too surprising about a man forgetting when a dog died some 70 years ago, or the circumstances in which it died, for that matter. Forget it, Louis. But he wasn't able to fall asleep right away. For a long while he lay awake, too conscious of the empty house and the wind that whined around the eaves outside. At some point, he slept without even being aware that he had gone over the edge. It must have been so, because as he slipped away, it seemed to him that he heard bare feet slowly climbing the stairs, and that he thought, "Let me alone, Pascal, let me alone. What's done is done, and what's dead is dead." And the steps faded away. And although a great many other inexplicable things happened as that year darkened, Louis was never bothered by the specter of Victor Pascal again, either walking or dreaming.